Let's go ahead and begin going over the various functions. Let's start first right here. The first thing we're going to look at here is the oscillators, and the most obvious thing for the oscillators is going to be the volume. So right here is volume for oscillator 1. This is volume for oscillator 2. Now if you turn them both up, then you hear both of the oscillators together. The second oscillator parameter that's critical is the waveform. So right now we're on sawtooth. That is another shape. It's just, I'm not going to give all of these some special label. This is sort of a saw pulse. You go down, you get something like a saw triangle, pulse, narrower pulse. For now, I'm going to show you this on both of these oscillators, and then we're going to go, this last section right here is special. If you see it, it's going to be a pulse and a pulse with a little line through it. And that whole range right there is special to work with. I showed you the shapes up to there, and same with the second oscillator. That's one of the benefits of the synthesizer, is that you can actually combine different oscillator shapes together that are a little bit unique or unusual, and sweep through them also. And I'll show you how to do that when we get to the modulation.
So now I'm going to get into PWM, Pulse Width Modulation. Now, before I proceed to talk about the pulse width modulation, I want you to look at the switch right here. There are 3 modes to the switch. This is a switch that's particularly dedicated solely to the pulse width modulation mode. So for now, before we start, I want you to flip that switch to LFO. Then you can follow along with me from there. So let's go forward from that point.
So let's talk about this particular section. We're going to go right here. Look at that. So right here, as you'll see, there's a regular square, and right here there's a square with a line through it. That line means pulse width modulation. So this is PWM, and this is just a standard static selection, meaning it doesn't move. So that's manual PWM, unless you move it with one of these switches right here. But there's built-in PWM, so you don't have to use any cables, and you can get it. And that starts right at about that line right there. And you can change the thickness of the PWM by moving it through that last little section. Starting there. And I'll just fast forward real quick to one thing, which is this rate. And I'll get to that as I talk more about the LFOs and so forth. But when you check out the rate, right? So that affects this PWM. As soon as you get out of that little section, the last little section between the dot and that pulse with the line, you go back to manual. And this is on both oscillators. So let's say you wanted to have 2 PWM oscillators. Let's say I wanted to have this one with a thin pulse, and this one with a thick pulse. Okay, so you can hear how those combine. So I said that it's default routed to the LFO. However, there's a way to change that. If you go to here, you see how it says right here, LFO ADS? This is specifically related to this pulse width modulation. So if you go to ADS, what happens is that this envelope 2 right here is going to be now controlling your pulse width modulation instead of the LFO. So like, listen. Right, you hear that? So it goes more towards the full square, and then it comes back up to where it is. And right when you get to the top, it's a little bit quirky here. You would think it's not going to have any effect, but it does. So you just have to kind of play around with it. It's not super linear and straightforward like on a digital synthesizer where you know what you're going to get as far as how much the movement of what affects what, but it's something to play around with. So you can hear that there's like a useful sound. And this actually works on both oscillators. So let's do this. You can hear it working on there too. Let's tune this back. Right? You can hear how that works. And then here's both. So this actually does the LFO plus the ADS at the same time on the pulse width. So again, it's a little bit quirky. I can't say that, well, when you move it this much, it's going to sound exactly like that, but the general routing is always the same. So like, let's turn this real slow again. Can you hear it? You can hear the ADS plus the LFO together. So we got the waveform, we got the PWM, we got the volume. So let's go to the next thing. That's very obvious, and that is the tuning of the oscillators. So when it comes to the tuning, I wouldn't say it's tricky. I would just say that it's not entirely intuitive here, but it's very easy once you understand it. So let's go back just to turn up oscillator 1. Let's get rid of that PWM because it kind of throws off the ear a little bit. You see that, first of all, this is tune. This is for the whole synthesizer. So there's two oscillators together, and as you move the tune, you move both oscillators with this tune. This is global tuning for the whole synthesizer, so for both oscillators together. It's very useful when just getting the tuning right for oscillator 1 and for tuning the final sound so it's in key and not drifting sharp or flat. And then you have this frequency. So this is a coarse frequency, meaning it has a very wide and steep immediate range. And you can hear how it would be very tricky to tune something exactly in pitch when you have to make such small adjustments. So let's say you're going somewhere like, and you want to tune it down a little bit. I try to usually get it as close as I can with the coarse. And then so that this stays closer to 0, because then when you're done with the patch, you can adjust it up or down a little bit as needed. But it's definitely a little tricky here. So that's oscillator 1. So technically this is the fine tune for both of them, but when you're just setting up oscillator 1, this is your fine tune for oscillator 1 because you don't have a separate fine tune for oscillator 1. And then let's go to oscillator 2. This also again acts as a fine tune for oscillator 2. Because again, it affects both. However, you have an extra function for oscillator 2, and that is this. So here we have the standard frequency again, the coarse tuning. Right? And then we have this called VCO2 beat. VCO2 beat, all this is fine tuning for oscillator 2 exclusively. So it's basically just like this, but only for oscillator 2. So what I typically do when, and you'll see, for example, if you get my patches, I give directions on how to tune this correctly. And if you're good with tuning by ear, that's great. Otherwise, you just put it in a tuner. And first you can set up oscillator 1 through the tuner and make sure that the patch is in key and on the proper note. So you get it right. Then you bring in oscillator 2. And it's called beat because that oscillator beating, wah, 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 that's basically fine tuning. So like you can hear the more it beats, the more detuned the oscillators are. The closer together it sounds, like slower it beats, the closer together and tuned the oscillators are. So right now, you see, now one thing to note is that this is not really always 440 hertz. And this isn't always going to be dead center. And this isn't always going to be dead center because this might be a little bit sharp. So for it to get exactly in tune, this one has to be more tuned flat, etc. So think of these knobs as essentially flexible and do it by ear or with a tuner. Don't think that these zeros or these markers really mean that much. Okay, so let's say like I wanted to do, for example, an octave up. There we go. There's an octave up, and then let's say we want to get it closer together. All right, and then let's try something like this a little bit with these parameters that we've already discovered so far. Let's put this on like a static pulse for the lower oscillator. And then let's put this to PWM. And then let's try something like I'll put my note an octave down. I just play an octave down, and then let's turn it into like a bass line. There's a thick patch. And now you can hear how if we change this oscillator shape or this PWM or this oscillator shape, you get a lot of different tones. Sometimes you have to turn the volume up or down because the volume is a little bit different depending on the shape you pick. Sawtooth there, maybe. Listen to that versus, or if we started moving this. There's a static pulse with a sawtooth. And let's turn up the beating. So you can hear how just using these oscillator parameters, we're starting to create a lot of interesting tones. Let's go from there straight into the next obvious step, which is the filter. And this is a nice juicy tone to really hear the filter of the synthesizer clearly. Let's go here and analyze the filter controls, which are located in this part of the synthesizer. VCF frequency, that's your filter cutoff, and there's your resonance, should be obvious. And then keyboard control, this is keyboard tracking. ADS control, that's envelope amount. And this is very simple, we just go through it real quick. VCF frequency cutoff. .24 dB low pass filter on this synthesizer. Resonance, turn it up. It can go into self oscillation. Okay, then keyboard tracking, it just how high up the keyboard you go with your notes. That determines how open the filter is. So without keyboard tracking, if I play different notes, if I add keyboard tracking, a little more, all the way. Finally, here we have ADS control. Now ADS is basically same as ADSR, it's just more simplified, so it's just the envelope. And here it goes positive or negative, that's why it starts at 0. First, I'm gonna hop right into the envelopes real quick, and then we'll hop back into this ADS control. So here's the envelopes. This is envelope 2, envelope 1 by default. Envelope 1 is the volume envelope. Envelope 2 is the filter envelope. So right now I have volume envelope full sustain. And here we have this is called decay, but it also functions as a release. If you have this decay switch, so that's what the switch does. If the switch is turned on, this is a release and a decay. Okay, if you turn the decay switch off, this is only a decay. That can be useful when doing various percussive sounds. Not just percussive, but any kind of sound that has a percussive element to it. For example, if you just want a short decay that's consistent every time that you press the key, you can turn that decay off. And if you switch the decay on, then you have a more ringing sound. So that's kind of why it's there. It's very similar to the Moog. So I'm not going to go totally into depth on how ADSR works and how envelopes work, because again, this is a tutorial for the Kobol synthesizer. It's not a tutorial for Basic Synthesis 101. And that I don't want to put a lot of time in that. But I just wanted to explain how these three knobs work and the decay release function. Now on the filter envelope, technically it's like the decay, the release function is always on. So this is always a decay and release at the same time. It's just when you turn the volume aspect of it off, you're not going to hear it anyway. This envelope is always tied to the volume. They can also be modulated into other places, but this one's always tied to the volume. So, and this by default is always tied to the filter. So it can be to the filter plus other places, but it is always tied to the filter unless you add something else in there, etc. So this is kind of how the synthesizer works in particular. It's semi-modular in the sense that it's pre-routed, and then you can add additional inputs, but you can't remove the routing. So this is always going to be tied to the filter. This is always tied to the VCA. Let's say you turn this release up. We're going to put the decay on right here, release all the way up. And now the ADS control, essentially it starts at 0. When you bring it to the right, to the positive number, it's like a regular envelope amount. But this also lets you do a negative envelope amount. Let's bring this keyboard control down a bit so we can get a cleaner sound. And let's just bring in the envelope amount here. cutoff down. Again, if you need a grip on basic synthesis concepts like how envelopes and filters work, you can check that out in some other places. But this is the ADS, so we're bringing this in a positive amount. And then if you expand this, you can see it's a release and decay at the same time. So if you turn the decay off, it doesn't really matter because you don't hear it anyway, right? And then you get sustain. Sustain here. Then you have attack. So if you use the ADS control negatively, you can actually bring the cutoff up, and then the attack goes down, and then the decay brings it back up. So it's like inverted, and you get different sounds. You can hear that? The decay is like becomes the attack. The attack becomes the decay because it's inverted. There's no invert on the volume, only on the filter, but you wouldn't really need it on the volume. But this is a standard synthesizer thing, so you can play around with that. And the sustain is inverted also, so the higher you bring it up, the lower the bass line is. And this is a release. That's why it's like coming back up. So that's how that works. So that's something you need to play around with and just try different options and seeing what ideas come to you. That's really what it's about, just being creative with those options there. So we understand how the filter works, how the envelopes work and interact with the filter. We understand how our oscillators work and how the tuning and waveforms and all of that work. So the last really built-in function, as far as before we get to the switches and the cables and so forth, is going to be the LFO. The LFO really, by default, it's only routed to one thing. So without cables, you only get the LFO, which is again the low frequency oscillator, that beating sound. It's only routed to that PWM that I showed you before, that pulse width modulation on the oscillators. Remember that? You go to PWM, and that's the rate of the LFO. You can see it says rate. It goes kind of into audio rate. So you can get like some kind of more atonal sounds and things like that. That's the only place where the LFO is active in the default routing. You can't put it to the amplitude, you can't put it to the filter, you can't do any of that. Otherwise, there is one way to bring the LFO in to control the oscillators. So outside of the default routing that's automatic, if you want, before we get to the cables, if you want to control the oscillator pitch with the LFO, you can do so here with this volume. And the volume, it's a little bit misleading because it's not really volume, it just turns up the LFO. So when you go to volume here, and right here there's a key where if this says VCO 1, this switch right there, that means it controls this. Basically, if it's off, it disables it controlling VCO 1. So let's turn off that PWM. If you turn it on, this volume controls VCO 1. But by default, it always controls VCO 2. So if this is off, and you go to the number 2, it doesn't matter. You can't disentangle that. So as long as the volume is up on this LFO, then it's always going to be controlling the pitch of VCO 2, no matter what. So if you don't want that LFO moving the pitch of this oscillator, you have to keep the volume down. It's the only way. And then again, if you activate it to the VCO 1, then it controls the LFO activation on both oscillators. That's what makes this synth a little bit unusual, is just some of the labels and the way that it kind of is interconnected. I just want to cover one last thing when it comes to the LFO. And let's just turn up the volume one more time so you can hear. And that's this button. This is a triangle waveform. This is a square waveform. Turn this down, go to the... So that just controls the waveform of the LFO from triangle to square. So that's the LFO. That's how that works as far as before we get to the cables or anything like that. The only other thing here that we go to before it comes to the cables is we're going to do the Oscillator Sync. And you'll also see why this LFO volume is hooked up in this kind of strange routing exclusively to Oscillator 2 and not to Oscillator 1 if you change this off, because it helps us to work with the Oscillator Sync. Let's get rid of this pulse width modulation and just put it straight to regular sawtooth. Now Oscillator Sync is right here, Synchro VCO 1. Now the sync sound is actually synced to VCO 1 and it syncs Oscillator 2. So the only place where you're going to hear the Oscillator Sync effect is on VCO 2. Let's bring this up. So the Oscillator Sync, again, this is something you should look up on how synthesizers work and so forth, but if you really want to get into it. But when the Oscillator 2 frequency is above Oscillator 1, that's when you'll hear the sync sound. So instead of tuning, it syncs it to Oscillator 1, you get that ripping effect. Right? So what if I wanted to move that? That's where the this part comes in. Because right now if I turned up the volume, it moves both, right? But if we disable that LFO 1 on VCO 1, now it's only going to move the Oscillator Sync sound. Like, check it out how it sounds when it's slow and more controlled. Right? Now imagine you can do that with the PWM. And you can always, of course, bring back some of the VCO 1, although it's not going to have a detune, but it adds texture, like thickness. Or you can add some more PWM on there. So you can hear how that's the Oscillator Sync. Turn that off here. And immediately you're going to hear how the oscillators are detuned. And only this one has LFO. This one doesn't, except for on this PWM. Until I turn this back on, then it's on both. This is good for vibrato effects when you have it on both. So if you want to have that, let's turn it down real quick to tune it. Okay, so that's how the whole entire panel works without getting into the cables. So what have we actually not even touched so far is this in one gain, out gain. This is only related to cables. That's why it's called the voltage processor. So this, when you twist these without cables, doesn't do anything at all. And here you have noise, white noise and pink noise, your noise generator. You'll see right here, it does not, you can't use it anywhere. There's no way to bring it in without cables. And that's why you get you get 2 cables in the box, just so you can use the fundamental functions of the synthesizer. So next we're going to move on to how we're going to use the cables and the patch points. Okay, time to get into some of the interesting things here. So we're going to go over the cables now. We're going to go over the cables. As far as what Behringer gives you in the box. So you have these 2 cables that come in the box. They are about a foot long, something along those lines, maybe 10 inches, depending on how you want to measure them. But these are good to get a lot of the patches that you're looking for. However, for this particular video, I'm going to be mostly using these 2 cables. But I'm also going to introduce a third one. This is a longer cable that I have, and it's also called a tip-top cable. These are just some recommendations that I have for everybody, that you get some tip-top cables. The way that these work is that they split the signal. They either split the signal coming out or going in, which means you can take 2 outputs and put it into 1 input, or you can take 2 inputs and split it out into 2 separate directions. So let's go ahead and get into the actual use of these cables, and I will show you some of the fundamentals for using them, and we're going to go over every single patch point on the synthesizer and exactly what it does and what is the optimal way to use it. Let me start with some of the fundamentals. How about that? And then we can go from there into the more advanced configurations. One of the things that's very common in synthesizers is the filter overdrive. So the idea behind the filter overdrive is that you can overdrive the sound of the oscillators into the filter, and it gives you a more saturated tone. There's no filter overdrive knob here, but there's a way to do filter overdrive with the cables. The way to do that is, you see this audio out on these phones. So the headphones is a very quiet signal, and the audio out is a louder signal. And the best way to do the filter overdrive is, if you want to just use these basic cables, which are short, because I'll show you how to do it real clean, but you're going to need some longer cables. But if you want to do it with the cables that came in with your Behringer, you go to audio out right here. You want to turn the volume down of the oscillator, because you don't want to have any, you kind of want to start with a clean slate. And then what you're going to do is you're going to put it into the VCF audio in. Okay, so what this does is, this is an input for the filter. You can put external audio either from another synthesizer or any other source into the filter of the synthesizer right here. You can even be from a guitar or a microphone or anything, if you can get an 1/8 inch jack, or you feed the synthesizer's output back into the filter like this. And then what we're going to do is, first, you can hear that right away it's distorting even with everything down, because it's too much. So we're going to turn the volume down here a lot. Just like that. Now listen. Also keep in mind that the resonance makes a big difference on the amplitude of the volume in the synthesizer. So as you turn the resonance up, the volume goes down. You're going to have to turn the other things up, like the volume output and so forth. You hear how it's overdriven, and then it's not, because it gets quieter. Let's turn it back up. Now you get that kind of overdriven sawtooth sound. Okay, and you can see without it, the tone is very different. So that's how you can get some really overdriven tones on the synthesizer with filter overdrive using your basic cables. But what if we want to do it cleaner without having to play around with balancing the volume all the time so carefully and so on and so forth? This is where we're going to get into this whole concept here of this voltage processor. Now, when it comes to the voltage processor, this is not just a voltage processor, this is a signal processor. And what I mean by that is that it can process either audio or voltage. Voltage is basically control signals like the envelope, the LFO, etc. Or it can process audio, such as any synthesizer. Think of it like a gain knob, a volume knob on audio, right? So if you look at the diagram here, it's actually quite important to pay attention to the diagrams. There's two inputs. One goes through an input 1 gain, which adds plus 10 volts. So it adds a gain boost here. So it's going to be a louder input here versus here. And it's got a knob. And one goes straight through the voltage processor, which comes out of the output gain here out. Or there's a reverse out. So reverse out is more for voltage, but straight out is good for audio processing. So let's go ahead and do it like this. We're going to put the audio sound back to normal, the volume. And we're going to go to audio out. We're going to put it into the input here. And take this output. And then put it into the VCF audio in. Right now there's no difference. But let's start to bring up the output gain here. You hear the resonance going down and we're getting that overdrive sound. There it is. Right? And you can hear how that's a little bit easier to do that way versus having to continually balance the volumes and so forth. But that also starts to show you how this output gain works. All right, so now we understand how the output gain works at the voltage processor. We understand how to get the VCF audio in and how to use it internally on this synthesizer for filter overdrive effects. Let's go ahead and try a different tone with continuing on the voltage processor here. And the next basic thing that you're going to need to know is how to get this noise generator out. Remember, as we went over the whole entire synthesizer, there's no place to get any noise signal, that white or pink noise out from the synthesizer. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's turn down the volumes of the oscillators. If we just press a key, getting nothing except for just a little click for the gain, for the gate and the envelopes. But let's try to get some noise out. Again, we'll follow the diagram. You see this noise generator, noise out, VCF audio in. Now let's play some keys. Boy, that is pretty loud, right? What do you think the solution is? Well, we can go here, like we did last time, in, out, VCF in, and now we do this. All right, so let's blend that with an oscillator tone. Now, here's the thing. What if you wanted to make that noise a performance? Like, let's say, for example, you were doing some kind of riff and you wanted to play the riff on a sequencer and you wanted to start turning this noise up. It's pretty loud. It goes pretty quick. You just start turning it up a little bit and it starts really getting up there quickly. So what is the solution there? That's where this second input gain comes in. So you take noise out, you put it into the second input gain. Then you got to do a little bit of basic addition in your head. So, or like multiplication. So basically, whatever is the maximum you bring up here, that's going to be controlling the maximum amount here. Let me show you in real terms. So basically, what this is going to do is, let's bring this up a little bit. Let's bring up the output gain first. You're not going to hear anything. Now, what do you think is the maximum volume that, let's say during my performance, I want to have this particular input gain, this particular noise? So let's think of that. Let's say that's the maximum volume, right? So now, when I do the regular output gain, and I bring it up, I'm bringing up the regular output gain right here because I already set this as the maximum volume. Now watch this. Okay, do you see how these two work together? That's all these knobs do, is do processing just like this. And that's their whole function, is to work together. Also, another thing, when you see this as plus 10 volts, what that essentially means is that it makes it even more loud once this is turned all the way up than just plugging it input 2. So that's especially useful if you have a very quiet signal, or maybe you're putting something into that input and it's just not getting enough modulation. By turning this all the way up, you can put it into that input gain and turn it all the way up for extra modulation, or keep it low to get that variability where you can use this more like a performance, and you have your range that you want to twist the knob at without having to micromanage very small nuances. So that's, now we understand how this voltage processor works, the in gain and the out gain. And this can be used for any signal, as I'm going to show you now. Let's go ahead and do something more, another fundamental thing. Let's get to this LFO. Remember how I was showing you how the LFO works with the volume routed to the oscillator and so forth? So what if I want to get this LFO out, and I want it to not just affect this PWM here, but I want it to affect something like the frequency, and I don't want to use this volume because I don't want to lose oscillator 2, because it's going to give me that vibrato that I don't want. So what's a way to do that? You see, again, let's follow the chart. LFO, this one goes through the volume knob. LFO out 1 with the volume. And this one does not use the volume knob. LFO out 2 without the volume. So what we want to do is avoid using the volume knob and avoid triggering this vibrato on oscillator 2. We can go clean LFO out to, let's say, VCF frequency. That's going to be, for VCF frequency controls the cutoff. LFO out 2 is clean. LFO out 1 is dependent on the volume knob. The problem with using that is that you're stuck with the volume knob. So it's okay if you don't plan on using the second oscillator, or you want that effect anyway. But if you don't want that volume knob effect on the LFO, you're going to have to take it out, LFO 2 right there. So let's see how this sounds. Right, but how am I going to turn this down so it's not so extreme? There's no way to do it right now. Except, what do we learn about the voltage processor? It's not just for audio, it's for signals. So let's take it in, out. And again, for most things, I don't even use this input 1 gain. I only use this input 1 if I have to. If for some reason I feel like, oh, I want that extra nuance, or I want that extra boost. Otherwise, I just go ahead and stick with the in 2 and go straight out the out gain. So let's go to VCF frequency again. Okay, you see how that works? Now, I'll just show you one quick thing, and we're going to get into controlling something else here in a second. But let's say hypothetically I wanted to control this VCO1 waveform. So let's just go straight to VCO1. You see the waveform here? Remember how we twisted it and it changes the tone? With the default LFO, we only have this PWM. But what if I wanted to move it somewhere around right here? Like that, right? Well, right now I can't, since there's only one LFO, unless I have an external synthesizer or module and I want to plug it into that VCO1 waveform. I only have one LFO, so I have to decide what's the master rate of my LFO. So I'd have to use the same rate as I'm using right now. So let's just plug that into the VCO1 waveform. Turn the gain down again. And let's see how it sounds as I bring the gain up. Let's turn down the speed. So what is going on here? It's doing this. You hear that? So the more I turn it up, the more it affects it, the stronger it gets. And I can do the same here on the VCO2 waveform. Same concept. That's VCO2. Now let me show you real quick. I'm going to show you a trick why I was telling you to get these tip-top cables. Because right now I have this on VCO2, but I don't have it on VCO1. So VCO1 I have a straight tone. VCO2 I have the moving tone. Now if I want to get a moving tone on VCO2, I can just use the regular PWM, as we've discussed. But let's say I want to do this. How do I do that? Well, there's where I can use my tip-top cable and plug that in. One end goes to the straight to the VCO2 waveform. One end goes to the VCO1 waveform. There's VCO1. There's VCO2. So now I have them both moving. But let's say, for example, I want to put this one instead of there. I want to put it to the VCF frequency. All right, so you can see how that works. And let's get rid of this tip-top cable and go use these regular cables, and let's try another source here from this output. How about the volume? Oscillator 1 volume in. You can see how one of the things that is very important to understand generally with all of these is what is an input, what is an output. If you see the arrow going down towards or up towards down here, the arrow faces the jack, it means it's an input. If the arrow like out right here faces out of the jack, or it says the word out, then it's an output. So output always goes to input. That's the way it always works. So if it says out or the arrow goes out from the jack, you take it out from there and you put it into where the arrow goes in, or it says input. So here we have, again, we're going to go LFO 2 out from this into the in of this attenuator, and then we're going to go to volume. What that does is controls the volume. You might think, well, what's the use of that? Well, check this out, right? Let's say we get a tone like this. Okay. And notice again, this is only for oscillator 1, so oscillator 2 is not going to be affected unless we plug a source into both. There's oscillator 2. Let's bring this into like a bass line, for example. So right now I have the gain down, so you're not going to hear that movement. All right, and now let's do this. This would be cool if it was, for example, something like a pad. And without using any second cable, we can still switch this to something like PWM for more motion. All right, you see how that works? Okay, and then let's just, I'll show you right here. What's the other one? VCO 1 frequency. Obvious. That's just the LFO goes directly to the VCO 1 frequency. And it's the same exact thing down here, VCO 2 frequency. VCO 2 waveform as we went over. VCO 2 volume. So you see how the voltage processor works. We went over both of these inputs, the output. We went over the inputs above the oscillators, the frequency, waveform, and volume. We went over the LFO outs. So we have some more of these other ones to cover. We went over the VCF frequency. I already showed you how that works. We can also put it in here into the resonance. So if we want to move that resonance up and down. Right? We already went over the VCF audio 1 in. The CV volt per octave, this one is kind of peculiar. This is if you have another synthesizer is very useful because it tracks the pitch. So it lets the pitch tracking be tied to this keyboard control instead of the internal pitch tracking. So if you want to pitch track through another synthesizer, this is a good one to use. Otherwise, it's not super useful unless you find a creative use for it to have some kind of up and down with this keyboard control or something like that. You can play around with that, but that just sends voltage to this keyboard control. And here's the ADS control, so we can essentially do something like this, put this as a slow LFO, for example, and then what it's going to do is it's going to bring this ADS like this, basically. Let's turn this gain all the way down for now, and I'll show you manually, and then you'll see as I automate it. One of the things that happens here is that when you plug something into this ADS control, it already starts affecting the voltage down. So as this is down to 0, it brings the voltage down. This is what I said earlier, how the synth is quirky. It doesn't act exactly as expected all the time. Like for example, a digital synthesizer, this would just mean 0. But you plug it in here and you're going to get this downward signal for whatever reason. That's just how it's built. So you have to compensate for it. But let's use some LFO to start moving this a little bit, like something like that, okay? You see that? That's how that works. Now, let's say we, instead of using the LFO, we're going to use this ADS out. Here you have ADS 1 out, although this cable can't reach. This is basically the output of this envelope, and this is the output of this envelope, ADS 2 out. This one we can reach, and it's actually often a better one to use because it's not tied to your volume. So it gives you some more flexibility in the tone. So let's do ADS out like this. And let's try another one up here. So VCO mod in. When I plug, this is a modulation. When this is plugged in, you see how this leads out from the LFO? When you plug in another modulator here, what it does is it gets rid of the LFO. Now, if I turn up this LFO, even with the VCO1 selected, it doesn't do anything because it's been displaced by this plug right here. It's been displaced by this envelope. So now when I turn up the envelope, right? So now that goes, it's actually controlling the tuning of both oscillators because I put it into this is the master input for the VCOs. So this controls both of them right here. So this is a good time to show you the reverse output. Guess what that does? It reverses this. Instead of the regular out, you get a reverse out. This is great, like, for example, you can do a Hoover sound. That's how the reverse out works. So it's essentially the same as the output here, but it's reversed. It's inverted. It's the same as turning this ADS down versus up that we went over, but for any signal. So you can do that on the pitch or anything like that. This VCO mod in, now we know this controls both oscillators. If I was just to stick it at one or the other, it would only control that one. So what's a good way, by the way, to do that? Let's go to VCO2 frequency in. Turn the Oscillator Sync on. Let's do regular out. There we go. Now we got our classic Oscillator Sync sound. So you see how those work, right? And if I was to put this tuning way up and I took the reverse out, we would get a reverse Oscillator Sync sweep. All right. So there we go. That's how all of those things work. So we went over these two LFOs out. We went over how to control both oscillators at the same time with the VCO mod in. We went over these inputs and outputs right here, the noise out. We went over the each of the individual control parameters for all of the oscillators and for the filter parameters. But here's some other additional cool inputs that we get here. So let's go to LFO out again, and let's put it to through our gain, and let's put it into something like this, like the filter attack. So let's turn it down first so we know we're not hearing anything. Now imagine this. Imagine the LFO controlling this attack knob. Like that. So let's do a low LFO, and we got it to the attack out. And if I wanted to add a little bit of more extreme of a modulation, I could take it into this input 1 gain, add the 10 volts. So you turn this all the way up. Let's see how it sounds now. And it's the same concept here with the decay, although I have to use a longer cord for that. So like, turn this down real quick. If I want that, I just turn the LFO to that. It's very useful. And we can do the same with the sustain. And it works exactly the same here with the amplitude envelope. So it's the same exact thing. You can play around with that. It's, again, attack, sustain, decay. And there's the ADS1 out, as we already experimented with the ADS2 out, so it's exactly the same parameters. So now we understand everything here. The only other things to get through is, let's talk about modulating the LFO rate real quick. So let's go to ADS2 out. And let's try to take it from the ADS2 out. By the way, if you don't plug anything into this input 1, this knob is not going to have any effect at all. But let's try this, and then what we can do is take this output and turn it to our LFO rate. Then let's make sure our LFO is controlling the oscillator pitch. And let's do like a slow sweep up in the LFO rate. So let's try that. So what this regular out seems to be doing is actually slowing it down. So you have to experiment with how the directions move. So what would I want to do if I want to speed it up? Well, one way is to switch the attack and decay. The other simple way is to try the reverse out. There we go. We just took the inverse envelope. And that's cool how the LFO started at audio rate there. Listen. Right? So One other thing that's cool too is that the noise, and we're going to get into next frequency modulation. That's the last thing that we have to cover. But the noise can often be used as a modulator too, as a signal, because it emits a steady sound, which can be construed as a control voltage. So let's try that. Let's see how fast we can get this LFO with this noise. Noise out. It acts as a stable control voltage. And again, if we, let's try the extra 10 volts and see if that makes much of a difference. Let's see how it sounds without it. So it actually brings up the maximum rate of the LFO more into audio rate, which is very useful, without having to use up our envelopes or anything, just using noise. So now we can do a little bit of frequency modulation. So you can see how that works. What's one of the most basic ways of frequency modulation also? Modulating things with the noise. So let's go right here. Again, basic in out. VCO 1 frequency, let's try that. Let's get rid of this LFO. Now we're going to have to retune this, obviously, because as you bring it in, the tuning changes. But you get this cool sound. Now let's get to our last point here, which is regular frequency modulation. Now the frequency modulation here on this particular synthesizer works in a little bit of a unique and interesting way. And the way that it works is that it doesn't really use this out gain right here. We don't need to use that up to get basic frequency modulation with the oscillators, because it has its own way that it works. If you actually follow the diagrams, it kind of explains it a little bit, but not really, so I'll explain it to you. The way that this works is these two VCOs out have a different way of working, okay? And you'll see what I'm talking about. So let's just bring in oscillator 1. If I put in oscillator 1 out and I put a plug out of here, nothing happens, right? Let's bring up oscillator 2. Let's take the plug out of oscillator 2. The sound is gone. So that's actually very useful, because what it enables you to do is use each oscillator in a different way depending on how you want to use it. Okay? So what I mean by that is, when you're using VCO 1 out, the more you turn up the volume, the more frequency modulation you're going to get, and the more you're going to hear oscillator 1 at the same time. So that could be useful for some type of sounds when you want to hear both of the oscillators. So for example, let's go to the VCF frequency. The more you turn this up, you can hear how it is having the effect. It's tied to this volume. So one of the things about this particular, using the FM from oscillator 1, is that there is no way to decouple the sound of the oscillator from the FM potential of it. But here, what this oscillator 2 does is it enables you to steal the volume entirely from oscillator 2, and you'll see why that's very useful. In some ways, this is a more useful direct FM signal than this one, because you're not bound to hearing the oscillator at the same time, right? So let's bring this oscillator up with a clean signal. Then we're going to go to VCO2 out. So now you see if we bring the volume up, nothing happens. What's going to happen is it's going to control the modulation strength of the FM straight out of VCO2 out. So let's go to the VCF frequency. There's filter FM. And again, if we wanted to add extra gain to that, put it through here, add 10 volts, maximum, out. Let's hear how that sounds. That extra 10 volts makes it more extreme. Let's just do some other FM tricks, like regular VCO1 frequency modulation input from VCO2. So this is straight up regular FM. All you got to do is plug it in. Right, so there's regular FM. And we can also FM the waveform, which is a really neat trick. So that's how we get FM. And again, it's all the same out of this one. It's just that you'll hear the Oscillator 1 volume as soon as you start turning the FM up from Oscillator 1. Last one we can try is the volume. This is kind of like a ring modulator, AM audio modulation. But that covers the whole entire synthesizer there. I don't believe that there's anything else that we missed other than this gate in. This is just used basically for external inputs, like from another synth or from a sequencer or something. Every time it comes in, it triggers the note, basically, is what it does. So if you're familiar with daisy chaining or plugging in sequencers, everything else is pretty self-explanatory. We get the MIDI in right here. They just put the MIDI, throw a MIDI cable. So that's everything. I hope that you enjoyed the tutorial. Thanks for stopping by. Leave a like, leave a comment. Subscribe to my channel. Check out the upcoming sound banks that I have for the synthesizer in various styles. I'm going to have a few of them. And enjoy your day. See you later.